Hi guys, and welcome to Personality Part 3, the social cognitive perspective. So we've looked at personality in a couple different ways. We looked at it from a psychoanalytical point of view, from a trait personality point of view, and now we're going to look at social, so environment, and then cognitive thinking. So we'll be covering a little bit of review with a couple of our social psychologist, and then a little bit of review with ourself and our self-concept. All right, so let's start out with what exactly social cognitive therapy perspective is. So kind of break that word down, right? So social, like our environment around us, and then cognitive, what we think the perspective. This theory was proposed by Albert Bandura. And just to remind you, Albert Bandura was the one that was looking at our environment on our actions with the children. So the Bobo doll, remember he watched, or he put a little kid in the room playing while someone kind of beat up that clown doll, and then when a child was put into an angry situation again, they again beat up the Bobo doll. So he was talking about what our environment can do on our actions or influence our actions. So Albert Bandura is our social cognitive perspective scientist, and he really wanted to emphasize how our traits interact with our environment and situations. So what if we have these traits, but what will we do in environments? Or do environments bring out traits? Or do our traits determine what environment we choose to live in? So the social behavioral approach is where we're looking at the interactions between the two. Okay, so let's look at something called our vocab word, reciprocal determinism. So this is kind of a big fancy word for just what we were talking about, that interacting influences of our behavioral, our thoughts, and our environment. So it's kind of our psychosocial biopsychosocial chart again. I'll put that up. So reciprocal, remember reciprocity, determinism. So what determines how we, what our personality is. So they looked at three different factors. So imagine someone who is considered to have a risky personality. So someone that might go bungee jumping. All right. So if I'm going to go bungee jumping, reciprocal determinism would say that there's multiple factors that would influence that. So first of all, my internal cognitive factors, my thinking, my thoughts and feelings about risky behavior. Do I think that that's okay, right? Am I going to live through this thing? Or do I feel like it's too risky, I'm not going to? My environmental factors, so things down here, those would be people in my environment. So do I have a group of friends that are risk takers that might ask me to go bungee jumping, and then I would be socially influenced? And then my behavior, learning to bungee jump. So that would be what I'm actually going to do, right? So it's kind of this combination of all three that will determine the decisions that you make. So these are reciprocal influences. It's not one thing, but how they all interact together. Now, the reason why reciprocal influences are the way that they interact with your environment are a couple things. So is it that I'm going to go back to that bungee jumping thing. Is it that you're a risky person and therefore you find risky friends? Or is it that you have risky friends and that you become a risky person? And what is that trait within you that determines that? So the ways that individuals interact with their environment and determine their traits. So people are able to choose where they live, right? Well, when you get older. But as a child, you're able to choose your environments most of the time. So what type of environment you will be around. And then you can look at how those things interact. Our personalities shape the way we interpret and react to events. So if we have an outgoing personality and there's an opportunity to be outgoing, or an event where we could be outgoing, that would shape the way we react to going to that event. And then our personalities also help to create situations in which we will react. So if I am always looking for new things to do, I might be listening for opportunities to go do new things, versus if I'm someone who's like an introvert and always inside, or reading by myself, I would never have that opportunity to be put in new situations to react differently. Okay, so those are reciprocal influences. Let's look at our biopsychosocial of our personality. You can screenshot this one or pause it. I'm not going to spend too much time. So our biological influences of personality, these are things like genetically, we are more likely to inherit our temperament. Definitely introverts are actually genetically shown to be connected. Our autonomic nervous system, remember we talked about people who are extroverts or want to be out, have low brain arousal, so they're always looking for something to activate their brain. Psychological influences, this could be our learned response, so right, our behaviors in different situations. Our unconscious thought processes, going back to our psychoanalytical with Freud, and our unconscious and our id and our impulses, and then our expectations and interpretations of events. And then our social cultural influences are going to be things like how we grew up, how we influence our situations, what is expected in our culture of personality, and the type of support that we have. Okay, so now let's go ahead and look at talking about personal control. So this is taking out of, we're doing this, the biopsychosocial of personality cognitive, talking about yourself and what type of personality and the personality traits, how they could actually influence the things that happen around you. So personal control is the extent to which we see ourselves to be in control of our environment. Okay, so if you feel like you have a lot of personal control, you feel like you're in charge of the things that happen around you. If you have a helpless perspective of personal control, that would mean that you feel like you are not in control of anything. And we'll talk about learned helplessness here in just a second. So there's two ways that psychologists have actually studied personal control. They can do one of two things. They can correlate personalities and feelings with achievements. Okay, so do like a study where they're just picking numbers and doing correlation and see if there's any type of relationship. Just a little bit of review. Remember, when it's a positive relationship, I do not want to update iTunes right now. Go away. Quit. Quit. Okay, there we go. So positive correlation is when both things move in the same direction. So high feeling of control, high achievements. A negative correlation is when they move in the opposite direction, okay? Another way that they can measure personal control is by experiments, by putting people in situations where they have high sense of control and low sense of control, and noting the effects that it has on their personality. Okay, so people with personal control are considered to either have one of two things. They either have an internal locus of control or an external locus of control. And that would be our next slide. So if you have an external locus of personal control, that means that you kind of think that all things happen because of fate and it's beyond your control. So you would say that you did really well on your test because of luck, or that you happened to get things together. It was other situations, or the teacher gave you an easy test. So an external locus being like the point of, would be blaming luck. Versus if you have an internal locus of control, your perception is that you control your own fate, that you determine how you do in situations. And the type of control that you have has been shown to influence your type of personality. So bringing it back to personality. If you have an internal locus of control, you generally have higher self-esteem, you're more in control of your environment. External locus of control, there's a lot of blame going on and not a lot of ownership for what happens to you. So self-control, how you can strengthen or deplete that, so things that can strengthen your self-control or deplete it. So your self-control is, again, your ability to control your impulses and delay gratification. And what studies have shown about people who have strengthened self-control or depleted self-control is there's a correlation between your GPA, so the grades that you will get in school, how well you adjust to a situation, and how well you will socially succeed, so the amount of friends you have, your relationship, things like that. So strengthening your sense of self-control, right? Controlling your impulses, delaying gratification, having that internal locus of control has been shown to have higher GPA, better adjustments, better relationships than those that have depleted self-control. And then we're going to do a little bit of review on learned helplessness. So having a depleted sense of self-control, remember, can learn to something called learned helplessness, which means that you give up in trying to control your environment because nothing has ever proved to help. So learned helplessness, remember, there's always uncontrolled bad events. Things are always going to happen. If you perceive that you have a lack of control in that situation, then you learned a helpless behavior. Meaning that if that continues to happen, you won't even try to control your situation because you've learned that there's nothing you can do. So that's learned helplessness. And remember, in animals or dogs, that learn to states of depression. Versus someone who feels that there's something they can do with that, having high personal control, would have a internal locus of control and more control over their situation, be a happier person. Now, there's an extent of this called, or a side thing of this called tyranny of choice. Sometimes when people have too many choices, I always think of this when I get a really, really big menu to order from. People tend to find that when you have too many choices, you actually are less satisfied with your end result than if you would have had less choices. So they gave people, like 30 items to choose from. And what happens is when you finally choose one, you're still always kind of second guessing, like whether or not you chose the right one, whether you've been happier in someplace else. They always recommend when you apply to colleges to make sure that you are narrowing it down, because sometimes you will feel more happy controlling your, like a small set, right? So choosing from a small set than you would if you choose from a lot. So that's called a tyranny of choice. Okay, let's talk about personal control versus optimism versus pessimism. So remember, an optimist is someone who feels good about their situations, good about their life. A pessimist might view things in a more negative view. So going back to the beginning there, we talked about that there's a correlation between people who are optimistic and their health. But we're going to talk about some bad things about optimism in this slide. So excessive optimism could actually lead to things like blindness to your own incompetence, looking at not studying for a test because you think you're going to do good on it. So what some studies have shown about Eastern versus Western culture is actually people who from the Eastern culture who tend to be more pessimistic about their achievements actually do better academically because they prepare more. They have that internal locus of control. They think that things are in their control, but they're pessimistic about what might happen. So they prepare more, they study more, they do better on tests, right? They don't have that blindness to their own incompetence. And positive psychology is kind of going off of this optimistic view. And this is actually, so if 99% of the people in our population are completely normal, positive psychology is a psychology or a what's that called? Type of psychology, a subtype, that's the word I was looking for, that looks on valuing strength and virtue over weakness and damage. So it's kind of an optimistic form of psychology. Okay, a couple more slides looking at the self, and then we are done. So exploring the self a little bit more. We talked about self-concept before break, but self-concept are all those things that when we talked about gender roles and how you feel about yourself. So when we're looking at shaping ourself, right, who we are, what they have found with children, this little kid playing doctor, is the more you allow yourself to have possible selves, the more emotional and social growth that you will make. So kids that are allowed to play like doctor and teacher and explore these possible things that they might do with their life are open to more opportunities and are therefore open to grow emotionally, cognitively, so thinking-wise and socially. And what studies have shown with kids that are able to do that is they become more self-control adults. Okay? Now the spotlight effect, this is something interesting about yourself. Put this in here. The spotlight effect is when you overestimate how much people are noticing you in a good or bad way. And what they did, I put this study in here, what they did at Cornell University is they took 100 students and they asked them to wear a shirt with Barry Manilow on it. So it's kind of, awkward or different. And they asked them to go to a lecture hall and predict how many people would notice they're wearing a shirt that has Barry Manilow. And over the majority of people, the average said that 60% of the people would notice they're wearing their shirt. And in reality, it was a little over 25%. So a quarter of the people even noticed, and then a week later, they couldn't even identify that person. So the spotlight effect is this overestimation of how much people are looking at you, your appearance, your blunders, things like that. Okay? Self-esteem then, going back with the self, is your feelings of high or low worth, and the benefits of having a high self-esteem, that's a vocab word, very short. The benefits of having a high self-esteem are kind of those same things, that you're more likely to have that internal locus of control your situations, then create situations that you will do good in. Okay? Self-serving bias is your readiness to perceive oneself as favorable. Can you see how I'm just trying to finish up all these vocab words before your test? So your self-serving bias is your readiness to perceive oneself as favorable. This is something that can also get in the way. So most people see themselves better than average and therefore have a they can have that bad effect on when they take a test or they go for an interview, things like that. So people accept more responsibility for good deeds than for bad. They accept more of their successes than their failures, right? This is considered a defensive self-esteem. It's kind of a defense mechanism, and it's completely okay, right? You don't want to feel feeling bad about yourself all the time, but it's good to be aware of your self-serving bias, and be cognizant that you might be looking at yourself in a more favorable light than you need to be. All right, so the moral of the story is study for your tests. Okay, last two words that I didn't even type in, we're looking at through cultures, whether you're an individualistic or collective self in the culture. And there's a chart that I'll print out for you guys. Print out, you won't even have to copy it down. And we'll look at what it looks like to be an individual in a culture and a collective self in a culture. All right, so those are the end of your personality part 3 notes. Have a great night. I'll see you later.